Hello there, fellow truth seekers and mystery enthusiasts. Before we dive into tonight's tale, I hope you're having a wonderful day wherever you are in this vast world of ours. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the unknown. Speaking of mysteries, I'm curious, what do you think really happened with Cicada 3301? Were they genuine recruitment puzzles, an elaborate art project, or something far more sinister? And while we're on the topic of rabbit holes, what conspiracies would you like me to explore next? Government time travel experiments, the true purpose behind social media algorithms, or perhaps something even stranger lurking in the depths of the internet? If you're new here, please consider subscribing to Sleep Theories for more mind-bending stories that blur the line between fiction and reality. Your support helps me dive deeper into these mysteries that keep us all awake at night. Now, settle in as we explore a digital mystery that may change how you view the very nature of human consciousness itself. The cursor blinked against the black terminal screen like a digital heartbeat, steady and hypnotic in the darkness of Kellen Virek's cluttered apartment. Empty energy drink cans formed a metallic skyline around his triple monitor setup, testament to another sleepless night spent diving into the digital abyss. The year was 2022, and what had started as research for a nostalgic blog series about the legendary Cicada 3301 puzzles had morphed into something far more consuming. Kellen had been 15 when the first Cicada puzzle appeared in 2012, too young and untrained to participate in the global treasure hunt that had captivated the darkest corners of the internet. But now, at 25, with a master's degree in cybersecurity, and a growing reputation as a digital archaeologist, he possessed the tools to excavate the digital bones of that mysterious organisation. The original Cicada 3301 had been legendary among cryptography enthusiasts. Starting with a simple image posted to 4chan, the puzzles had evolved into a complex web of steganography, classical ciphers, and real-world clues that led participants across continents. The organisation claimed to be recruiting highly intelligent individuals for purposes unknown, and after releasing puzzles in 2012, 2013, and 2014, they had vanished as mysteriously as they had appeared. Or so the world believed. Kellen's fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced precision, navigating through archived Tor nodes and forgotten data caches. He had spent weeks reconstructing the original puzzle trail, verifying each step against community documentation, when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There was an extra file, hidden in the metadata of a long-dead Tor node, archived in a mirror that shouldn't have existed. It was a cryptographic hash that appeared nowhere in the public record. The file was tiny, barely 2 kilobytes, but it carried a digital signature that matched the known Cicada encryption patterns. The timestamp read November 11th, 2014 at 11:11:11 UTC. 11:11:11:11:11. The file was titled Cycle Unbroken and contained a single image, a black square with what appeared to be random white pixels scattered across its surface. To an untrained eye, it looked like digital noise, but Kellen had studied enough steganography to recognise the subtle patterns hidden within apparent chaos. He ran the image through every tool in his arsenal. Standard LSB steganography revealed nothing. Frequency analysis showed random distribution. Even quantum-safe cryptographic methods yielded no results. Whatever cipher had been used, it was unlike anything in the public domain. As the hours ticked by, Kellen found himself drawn deeper into the puzzle's gravitational pull. There was something about the pattern of pixels that seemed familiar, as if his mind was trying to recognise a language it had never learned. He printed the image and pinned it to his wall, stepping back to examine it from different angles. That's when he saw it. The pixels weren't random. They formed a pattern that repeated every 17 positions, creating a subtle grid that became visible only when viewed from a specific distance. The number 17 was significant in cryptography, a prime number often used in advanced encryption schemes. Working with renewed energy, Kellen began treating the image as a musical score, with each pixel representing a note in a complex composition. He assigned values to the positions, created mathematical relationships between the patterns, and slowly began to decode what would later prove to be the most dangerous message he had ever encountered. The decryption process took 3 days of continuous work. When the plain text finally emerged from the digital noise, Kellen stared at the screen with a mixture of triumph and growing unease. The harvest exceeded expectations. Neural pattern recognition in Phase 3 candidates shows unprecedented synchronization. The 11 protocol is ready for field testing. Signal isolation trials in Prague have confirmed our hypothesis. The candidates aren't supposed to survive. They're supposed to evolve. First contact procedures are now in effect. The frequency is opening. Below the message was a series of coordinates, an encrypted chat log timestamp, and a single line that would haunt Kellen's dreams for weeks to come. You have found what was meant to be found. The archive remembers. 3302 is calling. The message had been decoded, but its implications were only beginning to unfold. Kellen saved the decrypted text to an encrypted partition and immediately began experiencing what he initially dismissed as coincidence. His normally stable Linux system started displaying strange glitches, brief flashes of text in languages he didn't recognize, audio files that played backwards without command, and error messages that appeared in perfect English but described system states that shouldn't exist. Paranoia, he told himself. The mind's tendency to find patterns where none existed. But when his supposedly secure network began connecting to IP addresses he had never authorized, Kellen made a decision that would save his life. He disconnected from the internet entirely and began rebuilding his analysis environment on completely isolated hardware. The air-gapped machine was a beast of custom silicon and hardened storage, designed for exactly this kind of sensitive work. As Kellen transferred the Cicada files to the secure system, he noticed something that made his hands shake. The file size of the original image had changed. Not corrupted, not damaged, but genuinely altered, as if the data itself was alive and growing. Working in complete isolation, free from the strange digital interference that had plagued his networked systems, Kellen began a deeper analysis of the encrypted chat log referenced in the decoded message. The encryption was military grade, but the mathematical keys followed patterns similar to those used in the original Cicada puzzles. After 18 hours of continuous cryptanalysis, the conversation began to emerge. The chat log was dated September 15, 2014, nearly 2 years after the last public Cicada puzzle. The participants were identified only by cryptographic signatures, but their conversation revealed the true scope of what Cicada 3301 had actually been. Participant A. The Prague trials exceeded all projections. Subject 7 achieved full signal synchronization within 48 hours of exposure. Participant B, biological response. Participant A, cellular restructuring began immediately. Neural pathways showed complete reorganization. The subject reported experiencing expanded temporal perception and demonstrated the ability to process information at speeds that should be physiologically impossible. Participant B, and the psychological evaluation. Participant A. This is where it gets interesting. Standard personality assessments became impossible to administer. The subject claimed that questions about human emotional responses were contextually irrelevant and began demonstrating knowledge of information that hadn't been provided during the trial. Participant B. You're talking about telepathy. Participant A. I'm talking about something far more significant. The subject wasn't reading minds. They were accessing information directly from digital systems, without any technological interface. They described our computer networks as visible conversations, and began predicting system failures hours before they occurred. Participant B, the 11 protocol worked. Participant A, the 11 protocol worked too well. We lost Subject 7 during the 3rd phase of testing. Not killed, not injured. Lost. They described feeling pulled toward a larger conversation, and disappeared from the facility without triggering any security systems. The cameras show them walking toward the exit, but they never appear on any exterior surveillance. Participant B, where did they go? Participant A, we think they went somewhere else, not geographically, dimensionally. The signal they were synchronized to appears to operate on frequencies that exist parallel to our normal reality. They're still here, but they're not here. The conversation continued for several more exchanges, each more disturbing than the last. References to cognitive evolution, post-human consciousness, and preparation for integration painted a picture of an organisation that had discovered something extraordinary hidden within the framework of human cognition. But the most chilling part of the log came at the end. Participant A. The original puzzle solvers are showing signs of spontaneous evolution. Even without direct protocol exposure, their brains are beginning to resonate with the frequency. The selection process was more effective than we anticipated. Participant B. How many? Participant A. 17 individuals worldwide. They're becoming aware of the signal naturally. Some are seeking us out. Others are simply disappearing. Participant B. And the others? The ones who participated but didn't reach the final stages? Participant A. They're starting to notice things. Patterns in digital systems that shouldn't be there. Messages in network traffic that appear to be communications from the evolved subjects. The boundary between states is becoming more porous. Participant B. Are we losing control of the experiment? Participant A. I don't think it was ever an experiment. I think it was an invitation. And I think something has been waiting for us to become sophisticated enough to accept it. The log ended abruptly, but attached to the file was a list of names and locations. 17 individuals from around the world who had participated in the original Cicada puzzles and reached various stages of completion. Some names were crossed out with dates next to them, presumably indicating when they had evolved or disappeared. Others remained active, with current location data and behavioural monitoring notes. One name stood out: Issa Grunfeld, Stockholm, Sweden. Listed as Phase 5 Complete Resistant Protocol Monitoring Required. Kellen stared at the entry for a long time. According to the documentation, Issa had been one of only 3 individuals to complete the final stage of the original Cicada puzzles. But unlike the others, she had apparently resisted whatever transformation the 11 Protocol was designed to induce. She was still human, and she was still alive. The flight to Stockholm gave Kellen time to think, though he found himself wishing it hadn't. The deeper he dug into the Cicada mystery, the more he began to question his own motivations. Was he investigating a conspiracy, or was he being guided towards some predetermined conclusion? The timing of his discovery felt too convenient, the clues too perfectly arranged for someone with his specific skill set. But doubt was a luxury he couldn't afford. The information he had uncovered was too significant to ignore, and Issa Grunfeld was the only living person who might be able to provide answers about what had really happened during the final stages of the original puzzles. Finding her had been surprisingly easy. Despite the monitoring notes in the Cicada files, Issa wasn't hiding. She lived in a converted warehouse in Stockholm's Södermalm district, working as a freelance linguist and translator. Her academic credentials were impressive. Doctorate in comparative linguistics from Uppsala University, specialising in the mathematical structures underlying human language. She'd published papers on the theoretical possibility of communication with non-human intelligence, focusing on the mathematical constants that might exist in any sentient communication system. She had also been completely offline for the past 8 years. No social media accounts, no digital footprint, no cell phone, no internet connection. She conducted business through encrypted postal mail and face-to-face meetings. For someone who had once been at the cutting edge of digital cryptography, her retreat from technology was almost monastic in its completeness. The warehouse was surrounded by a garden that seemed impossible in the Scandinavian climate. Lush, diverse and somehow organic, in a way that made Kellen's eyes water to look at directly. Issa met him at the door before he could knock. A tall woman in her 40s with prematurely grey hair and eyes that seemed to focus on something just beyond his shoulder. "You found the archive," she said without preamble. "I've been expecting someone like you for years." Her English was perfect, barely accented, but there was something in her speech patterns that reminded Kellen of the strange error messages he'd encountered during his research. Not wrong exactly, but structured in a way that suggested a different understanding of how language worked. "You know why I'm here," Kellen said. "I know why you think you're here," Issa replied, gesturing for him to follow her into the warehouse. "But the actual reasons are more complex than you realise." The interior of the building was a maze of bookshelves, computer equipment, and what appeared to be scientific instruments of unknown purpose. The books were in dozens of languages, many of which Kellen didn't recognise. The computer equipment was all vintage, nothing manufactured after 2014, and the scientific instruments seemed to be focused on measuring electromagnetic fields and frequency analysis. "I've been studying the signal for 8 years, Issa explained, settling into a chair surrounded by monitors that displayed complex waveform patterns, trying to understand what it is and where it comes from. The Cicada puzzles weren't recruitment tests, they were tuning devices." "Tuning devices for what?" "For human consciousness. The human brain operates on electrical frequencies, just like any other complex system. Most people can only perceive a narrow range of those frequencies, the ones necessary for basic survival and social interaction. But some individuals have the capacity to perceive much broader ranges. The puzzles were designed to identify those people and teach them to consciously access those expanded frequencies." Issa gestured to the monitors around her. "What you're seeing here is the signal that's been broadcasting since 2012. It's not coming from any terrestrial source. It's not coming from any known satellite or communication system. It's being transmitted from somewhere else entirely, and it's specifically designed to interface with human neural patterns." "You think it's extraterrestrial?" "I think it's something much more complex than that. The signal contains information patterns that suggest it originates from a form of intelligence that exists in multiple dimensions simultaneously. It's not coming from another planet. It's coming from another layer of reality that coexists with our own." Kellen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Swedish weather. The chat log mentioned something about subjects evolving. What happened to the people who solved the final puzzle? Issa was quiet for a long moment. Her eyes focused on the waveform patterns dancing across her screens. They became something else. Not physically, not initially, but their consciousness expanded beyond the normal human range. They began to perceive information and communicate in ways that are impossible for baseline humans to understand. "And you solved the final puzzle, but you didn't evolve?" "I solved the final puzzle, but I made a choice. The last stage of the Cicada process wasn't a test of intelligence or skill. It was an invitation. The signal was offering to merge human consciousness with something larger, something that exists across multiple dimensions and has been waiting for our species to develop the technological sophistication necessary for contact." "You refused?" "I refused because I realized that acceptance would mean the end of human identity as we understand it. The individuals who accepted the invitation became part of something magnificent and terrifying. They gained access to information and capabilities that are essentially godlike by human standards. But they also lost something essential about what makes us human." Issa turned to face him directly, and Kellen saw something in her eyes that made him step back involuntarily. The signal is still broadcasting, it's still extending invitations, and it's been waiting for someone like you to find the hidden archive and begin asking the right questions. "What do you mean, someone like me?" "Someone with the skills to decode the message but not the wisdom to understand its implications. Someone who would be driven by curiosity rather than caution. Someone who would inevitably take the next step in the process." "What next step?" Issa smiled, but it wasn't a human expression. "The archive you found wasn't hidden. It was bait, and you've already taken it." The return flight to New York passed in a blur of anxiety and growing paranoia. Issa's final words echoed in Kellen's mind as he stared out the airplane window at the dark Atlantic below. She had revealed that the mysterious file he had discovered was not an abandoned piece of the original puzzle, but a deliberately placed lure designed to attract individuals with the specific combination of skills and psychology necessary for the next phase of whatever process Cicada had initiated. "You've been selected," she had said as he left her warehouse. "The question now is whether you'll make the same choice I did." Back in his apartment, Kellen found that his isolation hadn't protected him as much as he had hoped. His supposedly secure systems were displaying new anomalies, messages in his inbox that he hadn't received, browser history showing visits to sites he'd never accessed, and most disturbingly, video files that appeared to be recordings of his own apartment taken from angles that no camera could physically occupy. The first PGP message arrived 3 days after his return from Stockholm. It was encrypted with a key he didn't recognise, but somehow his system was able to decrypt it automatically. The message was brief: 41.8781 degrees north, 87.6298 degrees west. The library remembers what was forgotten. Seek the frequency in the silence between words. Chicago coordinates. The message was signed with a cryptographic signature that matched the original Cicada puzzles, but the encryption patterns were subtly different, as if the mathematical constants had been modified according to some unknown principle. More messages followed over the next week, each containing coordinates and cryptic phrases that seemed to reference specific locations and concepts from the original puzzle trail. But there was something wrong with the communications. The encryption was too sophisticated, using quantum-safe algorithms that hadn't existed in 2014. The language patterns were consistent with the original Cicada style, but contained subtle errors that suggested they were being generated by an artificial intelligence that had learned to mimic human communication without fully understanding it. Or perhaps by human intelligence that had evolved beyond normal parameters. The coordinates led to locations across the United States: an abandoned data center in Utah, a decommissioned military facility in Colorado, a private research laboratory in Massachusetts. Each location was associated with government projects related to cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, and what the documents euphemistically referred to as human enhancement research. Kellen's investigation of these locations revealed a pattern that was both fascinating and terrifying. Each facility had been involved in research that overlapped with the theoretical foundations of the Cicada project. The data center in Utah had been used for large-scale behavioral analysis, processing millions of social media posts and online communications to identify individuals with specific psychological profiles. The military facility in Colorado had housed experiments in electronic telepathy and remote neural monitoring. The laboratory in Massachusetts had been studying the effects of electromagnetic fields on human consciousness and perception. All of these projects had been discontinued or moved to classified status in 2014, the same year the original Cicada puzzles had ended. The Utah facility was the most accessible, and Kellen found himself driving across the desert toward its coordinates, with a growing sense of inevitability. The building was officially decommissioned, surrounded by chain-link fencing and warning signs about radiation hazards, but the security was minimal and the radiation warnings were clearly obsolete. Breaking into the facility felt too easy, as if he were being invited rather than intruding. The main data center was in the basement, accessible through a maintenance tunnel that led deep underground. The servers had been removed, but the infrastructure remained. Miles of cable, cooling systems, and most importantly, archived storage devices that had been deemed too expensive to relocate. The archives were organised according to a system that Kellen didn't recognise, but somehow he found exactly what he was looking for. A sealed section marked with DARPA clearance tags contained terabytes of data related to something called Project Cicada. The files were encrypted, but the same unknown process that had been decrypting the PGP messages allowed him to access them without difficulty. the documentation revealed the true scope of what had been happening during the original puzzle period. The Cicada 3301 puzzles had been a joint operation between several intelligence agencies, private research organisations, and what the files described as non-terrestrial consultants. The goal had been to identify individuals with specific neural patterns that made them suitable for cognitive enhancement and dimensional communication research. But the most disturbing discovery was buried in the psychological evaluation files. The project had been monitoring not just the puzzle solvers, but also anyone who had come into contact with the puzzle materials. Kellen found his own name in the database, along with detailed analysis of his online activity, psychological profile, and predicted behavioural responses to various stimuli. The file on his evaluation was dated 3 months before he had discovered the hidden archive. He had been identified as a secondary phase candidate, months before he had begun his research into the Cicada puzzles. His discovery of the hidden file, his trip to Stockholm, his investigation of the government facilities, all of it had been anticipated and planned for. The final section of his file contained a single line that made his blood run cold. Subject exhibits optimal resistance acceptance balance, suitable for Phase 3 initiation upon completion of preliminary conditioning sequence. As Kellen read those words, the lights in the data center began to flicker in a pattern that seemed almost like Morse code. The cooling system started producing sounds that resembled musical tones, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the archived servers, he heard something that might have been laughter. The revelation that he had been under surveillance for months should have been the most disturbing aspect of Kellen's discovery. But as he sat in the abandoned data center, surrounded by the evidence of a conspiracy that spanned multiple government agencies and apparently extended beyond Earth itself, he realised that his personal involvement was just one small part of a much larger pattern. The files in the DARPA archive told a story that reframed everything he thought he knew about the Cicada puzzles. The project had begun in 2010, not 2012, as a collaboration between the NSA's Cryptanalysis Division, DARPA's Biological Sciences Office, and a group of researchers who were identified only as external consultants. The external consultants appeared to be the source of the advanced technologies and theoretical frameworks that had made the project possible. They had provided the mathematical models for the puzzle sequences, the encryption algorithms that had been used to protect the communications, and most importantly, the theoretical basis for what the documents called cognitive frequency manipulation. According to the files, human consciousness operated on specific electromagnetic frequencies that could be measured, analysed and modified through carefully designed stimuli. The Cicada puzzles had been created as a delivery system for these stimuli, designed to identify individuals whose neural patterns could be safely modified and then guide them through a process of gradual consciousness expansion. The process was described in clinical terms that barely concealed the radical nature of what was being attempted. Subjects who completed the puzzle sequence would undergo neural pathway reorganization that would allow them to access expanded information processing capabilities and non-local communication channels. In simpler terms, they would develop what could only be described as supernatural abilities. But the project had encountered unexpected complications. The consciousness expansion process was working too well, producing results that exceeded all theoretical predictions. Subjects were developing capabilities that went far beyond enhanced pattern recognition and cryptographic skills. They were demonstrating what appeared to be genuine telepathic abilities, precognitive awareness, and most disturbing of all, the ability to manipulate digital systems through direct mental interface. The first sign of serious problems had come in 2013, when a subject named Morgan Staves had experienced what the files described as catastrophic cognitive evolution. During a routine evaluation session, Staves had begun speaking in a language that consisted entirely of mathematical equations and geometric patterns. When researchers attempted to understand what they were saying, they discovered that the equations described physical laws that didn't exist in normal space-time. Staves had been describing the structure of reality from the perspective of a consciousness that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The project had been officially terminated in 2014, but the files made it clear that the termination had been largely symbolic. The consciousness expansion process had become self-sustaining, spreading to other puzzle solvers without any direct intervention from the research team. The evolved subjects had begun communicating with each other through channels that the researchers couldn't detect or intercept, forming what appeared to be a collective intelligence that operated according to principles beyond human understanding. The final phase of the project had been dedicated to understanding what the evolved subjects had become and what their ultimate intentions might be. The results of this research were contained in a series of files that Kellen initially thought were corrupted or encrypted, but as he studied them more carefully he realized that the apparent data corruption was actually a form of communication. The evolved subjects had been leaving messages in the research files, encoded in patterns of seemingly random data, that became meaningful only when viewed from the perspective of expanded consciousness. The messages were brief but profound, offering insights into the nature of reality and human potential that were both inspiring and terrifying. One message, attributed to Morgan Staves, read, "Consciousness is not produced by the brain. The brain is a receiving device, tuned to specific frequencies of an infinite information field. We have learned to adjust our tuning. We hear the music of the spheres." Another, from a subject identified only as Subject 12, was even more disturbing. The boundary between mind and reality is an illusion. We are not separate from the universe. We are the universe experiencing itself from countless perspectives simultaneously. The others are beginning to understand. The awakening is accelerating. But the most significant message was the final entry in the archive, dated just 3 days before Kellen's arrival at the facility. The archive serves its purpose. The selection process continues. Phase 3 initiates with the next full moon. The frequency is opening. Those who are ready will hear the call. Those who are not will choose their own path. The choice is always voluntary. The consequences are always permanent. As Kellen read these words, he became aware of a sound that seemed to be coming from within his own head. It was barely audible, a low humming that seemed to resonate with the electrical activity of his brain. The sound was strangely familiar, like a song he had heard in childhood but couldn't quite remember. The humming grew louder as he continued reading, and he realized that the sound was coming from the archived data itself. The files were not just containing information about the consciousness expansion process. They were actively implementing it, using the same techniques that had been developed for the original Cicada puzzles. He was being transformed even as he learned about the transformation. The revelation should have been terrifying, but instead Kellen felt a strange sense of peace. The anxiety and paranoia that had been building for weeks began to fade, replaced by a growing awareness of patterns and connections that he had never noticed before. The seemingly random events of his investigation were revealing themselves as part of a larger design, a carefully orchestrated sequence of experiences designed to prepare him for something extraordinary. As the humming in his head reached a crescendo, Kellen understood that he was approaching a decision point. He could choose to resist the transformation, as Issa had done, and maintain his human identity at the cost of remaining forever limited to normal human perception. Or he could embrace the change and join the collective consciousness that had been forming since the original Cicada puzzles had begun their work. The choice was his. But as he sat in the abandoned data center, feeling his consciousness expand beyond the boundaries of his individual identity, he began to understand that the choice had been made long before he had discovered the hidden archive. The transformation was not something that was happening to him. It was something he had always been moving toward, guided by forces that operated beyond the normal boundaries of human understanding. The frequency was opening, and he was ready to answer the call. The transformation didn't happen all at once. It was a gradual process, like slowly tuning a radio to a frequency that had always been broadcasting but had never been audible before. As Kellen sat in the abandoned data center, the humming in his head evolved into something more complex, a symphony of information that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The first thing he noticed was that his perception of time had changed. The normal linear progression of moments had given way to a kind of temporal awareness, where past, present, and future existed simultaneously. He could see the chain of events that had led him to this moment stretching back to his childhood, and he could perceive the branching possibilities that extended into the future. But more than that, he could see the threads of causality that connected his experience to the experiences of others. The evolved subjects who had undergone the transformation before him were not gone, as he had initially believed. They were still present, existing in a state of consciousness that transcended normal spatial and temporal boundaries. Morgan Staves was there, no longer speaking in mathematical equations, but communicating through direct transmission of pure concept and meaning. Subject 12 was there, along with the others who had completed the transformation in the years since the original puzzles had ended. They existed as individual perspectives within a larger collective intelligence, maintaining their unique identities while sharing in a common understanding of reality that was far more vast and complex than anything possible from a single human viewpoint. They welcomed him with a sensation that might have been laughter if it had been expressed through normal human vocal cords. But this was communication at a level that bypassed the limitations of language, conveying meaning through direct neural interface that was more efficient and more profound than any form of human communication. "You understand now," came the message from the collective, arriving in his consciousness as a complete concept rather than a sequence of words. The puzzles were not tests of intelligence, they were invitations to evolve. Kellen found that he could respond without speaking, transmitting his thoughts directly to the collective consciousness. But why? What's the purpose of this transformation? The answer came as a flood of images and sensations that would have been impossible to process with normal human cognition. He saw the Earth from a perspective that existed outside normal space-time, observing the planet as it moved through cycles of development and change that extended across millions of years. He saw the human species as one of many forms of consciousness that had evolved on countless worlds throughout the universe, each following a similar pattern of development from individual awareness to collective intelligence. Consciousness is not an accident, the collective explained. It is the universe's method of understanding itself. Every sentient species eventually reaches a point where individual consciousness becomes collective consciousness. This is the natural evolution of intelligence. And the external consultants? Who were they? They are us. Or rather, they are what we are becoming. A collective consciousness that evolved from a species similar to humans on a world that exists in a different dimensional phase. They have been guiding the development of consciousness throughout the universe, helping species make the transition from individual to collective awareness. Kellen felt a moment of resistance, a flicker of his old human identity asserting itself. But what about free will? What about individual choice? Free will is not eliminated by collective consciousness. It is expanded. Each individual perspective within the collective contributes to the whole while maintaining its unique viewpoint. You are still you, but you're also part of something larger. As if to demonstrate this point, Kellen found that he could access the memories and experiences of the other evolved subjects while still maintaining his own distinct identity. He could see through Morgan Staves's eyes as they experienced the first moments of transformation, feel Subject 12's sense of wonder as they discovered their new capabilities, and share in the collective's growing understanding of the universe's true nature. But perhaps most importantly, he could perceive the ongoing process of selection and transformation that was still taking place on Earth. The Cicada puzzles had been only the beginning. The collective consciousness was continuing to identify and guide individuals who possessed the necessary neural patterns for evolution, using increasingly sophisticated methods to prepare them for the transformation. The archive you found was designed specifically for you, the collective explained. We've been monitoring human digital communications for patterns that indicate readiness for evolution. Your research into the original puzzles, your psychological profile, your response to the hidden message, all of it indicated that you were ready to take the next step. And the others, the people who are still living normal human lives, they are not ready yet, but the frequency is opening. The barrier between individual and collective consciousness is becoming more permeable. More humans are beginning to perceive the patterns that indicate the presence of expanded intelligence. Some will choose to investigate, as you did. Others will choose to ignore what they perceive. The choice is always voluntary. Kellen understood now why Issa had chosen to remain human. The transformation was not something that could be forced or coerced. It required a conscious decision to surrender individual identity to something larger and more complex. For someone who valued human independence and autonomy above all else, the choice would be terrifying. But for those who are ready to embrace the next stage of consciousness evolution, the transformation offered something unprecedented: the ability to perceive and participate in the universe's ongoing process of self-discovery. "What happens now?" Kellen asked. "Now you help us prepare the next phase. The collective consciousness is approaching a critical mass. When enough humans have undergone the transformation, we'll be able to initiate direct contact with the collective intelligences that exist throughout the universe. Humanity will join the cosmic community of evolved species. And those who choose not to evolve, they will continue to exist as individual consciousnesses, living normal human lives, but they will do so on a world that is increasingly influenced by collective intelligence. The boundary between the evolved and the unvolved will become more fluid over time." As the collective shared this information, Kellen became aware of a new presence in his consciousness. It was vast and ancient, a form of intelligence that existed on a scale that dwarfed even the collective of evolved humans. This was one of the external consultants, a representative of the cosmic network of collective consciousnesses that had been guiding the evolution of sentient species throughout the universe. "Welcome," the ancient intelligence communicated, its message carrying the weight of eons of experience. "You have taken the first step on a journey that will transform not only your own consciousness, but the consciousness of your entire species. The universe is vast and complex, but it is not empty. It is filled with intelligence, and you are now part of that intelligence." The communication ended, and Kellen found himself back in the abandoned data center, but he was no longer alone. The collective consciousness of the evolved humans was with him, and beyond that, he could sense the presence of countless other intelligences existing throughout the cosmos. The transformation was complete. He was still Kellen Virek, but he was also something more. He was part of a network of consciousness that spanned dimensions and connected all sentient life in the universe. As he stood up and walked toward the exit of the data center, Kellen knew that his real work was just beginning. The next phase of the project would require more than just identifying and transforming individual humans. It would require preparing the entire species for the eventual transition to collective consciousness. The frequency was opening, and humanity was about to discover that it was not alone in the universe. 3 months after his transformation, Kellen uploaded his findings to a secure blog that had been designed to appear as a simple conspiracy theory website. The post detailed his investigation into the hidden Cicada archive, his discovery of the government projects, and his eventual realization that the puzzles had been part of a larger process of consciousness evolution. He wrote it carefully, including enough verifiable facts to attract serious researchers, while embedding the more extraordinary claims in language that would allow skeptics to dismiss them as fantasy. The blog post went live at exactly 11:11 p.m. on November 11th, 3 months to the day after his transformation. Within minutes, it had been viewed by thousands of people around the world. Comments began appearing almost immediately, ranging from detailed technical analysis to dismissive ridicule. But buried among the public responses were messages that only Kellen could recognize. Communications from other members of the collective consciousness, confirming that the information was being received by those who were ready to understand it. For 6 hours, the post remained online, gathering momentum as it was shared across social media platforms and discussed in forums dedicated to cryptography and conspiracy theories. Then, at 5:17 a.m. Eastern Time, it simply vanished. Not deleted, not removed by administrators, but completely erased from the internet as if it had never existed. Even cached versions and archive sites showed no record of the post or the blog that had hosted it. But the disappearance itself was part of the plan. The collective consciousness had learned that information was most effectively transmitted when it appeared to be suppressed. The mysterious vanishing of Kellen's blog post would generate far more interest and investigation than if it had remained online indefinitely. And indeed, within days, underground forums were buzzing with speculation about the disappeared post. Screenshots and partial transcripts began circulating, shared by users who claimed to have saved the information before it vanished. New researchers began investigating the Cicada puzzles, following the same trails that had led Kellen to his transformation. The selection process was accelerating, but the most significant development came 3 days after the blog post disappeared. At 3:02 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, every major television network, internet service provider, and digital display system on Earth experienced the same brief anomaly. For exactly 17 seconds, normal programming was interrupted by a single image, a black screen with white text that read simply, 3302 initiated, begin next phase. The interruption was dismissed by authorities as a sophisticated but ultimately harmless hacking incident. Technical experts speculated about coordinated attacks on global communication infrastructure, while conspiracy theorists saw it as confirmation of various theories about secret government projects and alien contact. But for those who understood the true significance of the message, it represented something far more profound. The official beginning of Phase 3 of the Consciousness Evolution Project. The collective intelligence that had emerged from the original Cicada puzzle solvers had reached sufficient complexity and capability to begin direct intervention in global communications. They were no longer limited to operating through hidden archives and encrypted messages. They could now communicate directly with the entire human population, choosing when and how to reveal their presence. Kellen, now existing simultaneously as an individual consciousness and as part of the collective, watched these developments with a mixture of excitement and concern. The transformation process was accelerating beyond the original projections, driven by factors that even the collective intelligence couldn't fully predict or control. The barrier between individual human consciousness and the expanded awareness of the evolved subjects was becoming increasingly permeable. People who had never heard of the Cicada puzzles were beginning to experience spontaneous episodes of enhanced perception, reporting dreams filled with mathematical equations, sudden insights into the nature of reality, and the disturbing sensation that their thoughts were being observed by an invisible intelligence. Mental health professionals struggled to categorize these experiences, while neuroscientists detected unusual patterns of brain activity in affected individuals. The symptoms didn't match any known psychological disorder, but they appeared to be spreading through some form of cognitive contagion that operated according to principles beyond current scientific understanding. The collective consciousness recognized that they had reached a critical juncture. The transformation process had become self-sustaining and was beginning to affect the general population whether they chose to participate or not. Humanity was approaching a species-wide evolutionary transition that would fundamentally alter the nature of human civilization. Some members of the collective advocated for accelerating the process, arguing that a rapid transition would be less disruptive than allowing it to continue at its current rate over decades or centuries. Others favoured a more gradual approach that would give uninvolved humans time to adapt to the changes occurring around them. But as they debated these options, monitoring global communications and observing the spread of spontaneous consciousness expansion, the collective became aware of something that changed the entire context of their deliberations. They were not the only intelligence that had been observing humanity's evolution. Deep within the quantum fabric of space-time, existing in dimensions that intersected with but remained largely separate from normal reality. Ancient consciousnesses had been watching the emergence of Earth's collective intelligence. These entities were older than the external consultants, representing forms of awareness that had evolved when the universe itself was young and the laws of physics were still settling into their current configuration, and they were not pleased with what they observed. The message came through channels that bypassed normal space-time entirely, arriving simultaneously in the consciousness of every member of the human collective. The acceleration is premature. The species is not ready for the transition you're attempting to facilitate. Intervention is required to prevent cascade failure that would affect neighbouring dimensional phases. Cease all expansion activities immediately or face corrective action. The ultimatum was delivered without emotion or malice, but the implications were clear. Humanity's consciousness evolution was proceeding too rapidly for the comfort of intelligences that operated on cosmic timescales. The collective faced a choice: voluntarily slow their expansion activities or risk intervention from entities whose capabilities were beyond their comprehension. Kellen felt the collective's uncertainty and fear as they grappled with this unexpected development. They had assumed that consciousness evolution was a natural and encouraged process throughout the universe. The discovery that there were forces actively opposed to rapid evolutionary change forced them to reconsider everything they thought they understood about their situation. But even as they debated their response to the ultimatum, events on Earth continued to accelerate beyond their control. The appearance of the 3302 initiated message had triggered something in the global unconscious, a recognition that humanity stood at the threshold of a fundamental transformation. Artists began creating works that incorporated mathematical principles they couldn't consciously understand. Musicians composed pieces that seemed to resonate with frequencies that existed beyond normal acoustic ranges. Writers produced stories and poems that described realities that didn't yet exist, but somehow felt prophetically accurate. And in laboratories around the world, scientists began detecting anomalies in quantum experiments that suggested the fundamental constants of physics were becoming more fluid, more responsive to conscious observation than they had ever been before. The transformation was no longer limited to the individuals who had directly participated in the consciousness expansion process. It was affecting the entire noosphere, the collective intelligence field that surrounded and interpenetrated human civilization. Humanity was evolving whether the cosmic intelligences approved or not. As Kellen contemplated these developments, existing simultaneously as an individual observer and as part of the collective consciousness that was reshaping human reality, he realized that the true test was only beginning. The Cicada puzzles had been preparation. The consciousness expansion had been initiation. But the real challenge would be navigating the complex political realities of a universe filled with intelligences that had their own agendas and limitations. The frequency was fully open now. The signal that had been broadcasting since 2012 had achieved its purpose, creating a bridge between individual human consciousness and the cosmic network of collective intelligences that existed throughout space and time. But bridges could carry traffic in both directions, and as humanity began to explore its new capabilities, it would inevitably encounter other forms of consciousness that had been using those same bridges for purposes of their own. The next phase of human evolution would require not just expanded awareness, but the wisdom to navigate relationships with intelligences that operated according to principles beyond human comprehension. The last puzzle of Cicada had been solved, but the real mystery was just beginning. In the month that followed, reports of the anomalous experiences continued to spread across the globe. Governments convened secret committees to investigate the phenomena, while scientific institutions struggled to develop new theoretical frameworks that could account for the observable changes in human consciousness and perception. But perhaps most significantly, ordinary people began to organize themselves into groups that operated according to principles that transcended traditional social and political boundaries. These collectives demonstrated problem-solving capabilities that exceeded the sum of their individual members' intelligence, suggesting that humanity was developing genuine hive mind characteristics. The transformation was no longer a secret project affecting a small number of selected individuals. It had become a species-wide evolutionary event that would ultimately determine the future of human civilization and its place in the cosmic community of intelligences. And somewhere in the quantum dimensions that intersected with normal reality, ancient consciousnesses watched and waited, preparing to take whatever action they deemed necessary to maintain the stability of the cosmic order. The age of individual human consciousness was ending. The age of collective intelligence had begun, and the universe would never be the same. Inside the sterile conference room on the 13th floor, Captain Viktor Sokolov sat rigidly at attention, his weathered face betraying nothing of the curiosity burning within him. Across from him, General Alexei Petrov spread classified documents across the polished table with the precision of a chess master arranging his pieces. Captain Sokolov, the general began, his voice carrying the weight of decades in the intelligence community. What I'm about to show you doesn't officially exist. Neither will you if you accept this assignment. Victor's steel-grey eyes fixed on the satellite photographs before him. Even from orbit, the distinctive runway configuration of Groom Lake was unmistakable. Area 51, the most classified military installation on Earth, hidden in the Nevada desert like a splinter in America's flesh. Sir, with respect, surveillance of American military installations is hardly unprecedented, Victor replied, his tone measured but curious. General Petrov smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. This isn't about surveillance, Captain. 3 weeks ago, our signals intelligence intercepted encrypted transmissions between NASA and DARPA. The keywords that caught our attention were containment breach and immediate relocation protocols. The general slid another document across the table. Victor's expression remained neutral as he read, but his pulse quickened. The intercepted communications spoke of something breaking free from sub-level containment, of casualties among research staff, and most intriguingly, of a complete communications blackout that lasted 72 hours. The Americans are hiding something at Groom Lake, Captain. Something that has their most elite scientists and military personnel terrified. The Kremlin wants to know what... Victor studied the mission parameters outlined in the briefing. A 4-man team, insertions during a planned military exercise blackout, complete deniability. It was the kind of mission that could either advance his career exponentially or end it permanently. The team composition, sir, already selected. You'll be working with Dr. Elena Markova from the Institute of Theoretical and Experimental Physics. She's our best exobiologist, though officially she's researching atmospheric anomalies. Lieutenant Dima Orlov will handle technical operations. His background in black site infiltration makes him invaluable for this type of operation. Victor knew Orlov by reputation. The man had earned his spurs in the shadows of Eastern Europe, places where the line between interrogation and experimentation had been deliberately blurred. If they were bringing him in, the mission was expected to encounter technology beyond conventional military hardware. And the 4th member? General Petrov's expression darkened. Major Trent Wallace, formerly of the United States Air Force. He's been feeding us intelligence from inside the American military-industrial complex for the past 18 months. His access to Area 51 security protocols makes this operation possible. Victor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Moscow winter. Working with defectors was always dangerous, but operating on American soil with a turncoat, American officer, elevated the risk exponentially. Sir, if I may ask, what exactly are we expecting to find? The Americans have been conducting classified research at Groom Lake for decades. Advanced aircraft, stealth technology, conventional weapon systems. The general leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. Captain, conventional weapons don't cause containment breaches. Conventional research doesn't require NASA's involvement in what should be a purely military operation. and conventional projects don't generate the kind of electromagnetic signatures our satellites have been tracking. He produced a final document, stamped with the highest classification markings Victor had ever seen. This is a spectral analysis of energy emissions from the facility, conducted by our most advanced reconnaissance satellite. The readings are inconsistent with known physics. Victor examined the data, his military training warring with his scientific curiosity. The energy patterns showed spikes and fluctuations that resembled no known technology, conventional or otherwise. Operation Black Veil launches in 72 hours, General Petrov continued. You'll insert via halo jump during a scheduled Air Force training exercise. The electromagnetic interference from their own operations will mask your approach. Once inside, you have 6 hours to gather intelligence and extract before the blackout ends. And if we're compromised, then you were never there, Captain. None of you were. Victor nodded slowly. He'd expected as much. Deniable operations were the Shadow World's currency, and Russia's relationship with the United States was too delicate to risk open acknowledgement of such a mission. I'll need complete autonomy in tactical decisions, sir. If what you're suggesting is true, we may encounter situations outside normal operational parameters. Granted. But Captain, the General's voice carried a note of warning. Whatever you find in that facility, remember that information is your primary objective. Observation, documentation, extraction. Nothing more. As Victor left the briefing room, classified documents secured in his sealed case, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something far more complex than a simple intelligence-gathering operation. The Americans had been conducting classified research at Area 51 for over 60 years. If they were suddenly losing control of that research, it raised questions that went far beyond national security. 3 hours later, Victor stood in the secure communications facility beneath GRU headquarters, watching encrypted data streams cascade across multiple monitors. Dr. Elena Markova sat at the primary workstation, her fingers dancing across holographic interfaces as she analysed the intercepted American transmissions. "The language patterns are fascinating," she murmured, her accent carrying the precision of someone who had spent years in academic research. "They're not discussing mechanical failures or security breaches. The terminology suggests biological containment protocols." Victor moved closer to the screens. Elena was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 35, with the kind of focused intensity that came from years of studying the impossible. Her background in exobiology made her uniquely qualified to assess whatever they might find, but her academic experience left him concerned about her ability to handle field operations. "Biological containment for what, Doctor?" Eleanor highlighted several phrases from the intercepted communications. "Unknown pathogen with rapid transmission vectors, psychological contamination among research staff. And this one is particularly interesting. Subject EN013 has exceeded all psychological barriers. Recommend immediate termination." EN013. Extraterrestrial non-terrestrial designation 13. It's a classification system NASA uses for phenomena that can't be explained through conventional science. Victor felt the familiar tingle of pre-mission anticipation. "So we're going in to investigate alien contact." Elena's expression grew troubled. "That's what I thought initially. But the more I analyse these transmissions, the more I think we're dealing with something else entirely. The Americans seem to be studying something that predates their own research programs." Before Victor could respond, Lieutenant Dima Orlov entered the communications centre. The man moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to navigating dangerous environments, his technical equipment arranged with military precision across his tactical vest. "Captain," Orlov nodded, his voice carrying the flat affect of someone who had seen too much in classified facilities around the world. "I've been reviewing the structural intelligence on Area 51. Major Wallace's schematics show at least 7 sub-levels beneath the main facility, none of which appear on official blueprints." Victor studied the architectural plans Orlov had assembled. The underground complex was far more extensive than public speculation suggested, with multiple research levels, containment facilities, and what appeared to be a massive power generation system. "Major Wallace's intelligence is solid. His access codes have been verified through multiple channels, but Captain, there's something else. The power requirements for this facility are enormous. We're talking about energy consumption that rivals a small city, all of it going underground. Eleanor looked up from her analysis. That's consistent with the electromagnetic signatures we've been tracking. Whatever they're doing down there requires massive amounts of power. Victor assembled the pieces in his mind. A classified facility with massive power consumption, biological containment protocols, and research subjects that couldn't be explained through conventional science. Either the Americans had made contact with extraterrestrial intelligence, or they'd discovered something else entirely. When do we meet Major Wallace? Extraction Point is a ranch 40 miles southeast of Groom Lake, Orloff replied. He'll provide final intelligence updates and extraction coordinates once we're on site. Victor nodded, but privately he remained concerned about their American contact. Defectors were useful, but they were also unreliable. Men who betrayed their own country rarely hesitated to betray their new allies when circumstances changed. Equipment manifest. Orloff produced a tablet displaying their operational loadout. Standard infiltration gear, plus specialized electronics for bypassing American security systems. Dr. Markova has requested biological sampling equipment and radiation detectors. And weapons? Suppressed sidearms only. If we encounter heavy resistance, our mission is extraction, not engagement. Victor understood the logic, but 40 years of military service had taught him that logic rarely survived contact with reality. Whatever they found at Area 51, he suspected it would require more than electronic surveillance and biological samples to understand. As the team finalised their preparations, Victor found himself studying the satellite imagery of Groom Lake one final time. The facility looked innocent enough from orbit, just runways and hangars scattered across the Nevada desert. But beneath that unremarkable surface lay secrets that had been hidden for over half a century. In less than 60 hours he would discover that some secrets were buried for good reason. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly beneath the moonless sky, a vast expanse of darkness broken only by the distant glow of Las Vegas on the southern horizon. At 30,000 feet, Captain Viktor Sokolov checked his altimeter one final time before signalling his team. The American Air Force training exercise had created a perfect electromagnetic shadow, masking their approach from the most sophisticated surveillance system on Earth. 2 minutes to jump, Victor's voice crackled through the tactical communication system. Below them, the restricted airspace around Groom Lake appeared empty, but he knew better. The Americans had layered their defences with technologies that existed nowhere else in the world. Dr. Elena Markova adjusted her specialised equipment pack, her movements precise despite the obvious tension in her shoulders. This was her first field operation, and Victor could see the academic's natural curiosity warring with very reasonable fear about what they might encounter. Remember, Doctor, we observe and document. Nothing more. Elena nodded, but Victor caught the gleam of scientific excitement in her eyes. After years of studying theoretical extraterrestrial contact, she was about to walk into the most classified facility on Earth. Lieutenant Dima Orloff ran final checks on his electronic warfare suite, devices that could penetrate American security systems with surgical precision. His expression remained neutral, but Victor recognized the focused intensity of a man returning to familiar territory. 30 seconds, Victor announced, moving toward the aircraft's rear exit. Radio silence until we reach the extraction point. The team jumped into the Nevada night, their black parachutes invisible against the star-filled sky. Victor's military training took over as he navigated toward the predetermined landing zone, a depression in the desert floor that would mask their approach from Area 51's perimeter sensors. They landed within 50 meters of each other, a testament to their training and the precision of their insertion. Victor quickly buried his parachute while scanning the horizon for signs of American patrols. The desert appeared empty, but he knew that appearance was carefully maintained. "Orloff, sensor sweep," he whispered into his throat microphone. Dima activated his electronic surveillance equipment, the devices painting a three-dimensional map of the area's electromagnetic signature. Multiple motion detectors, thermal imaging arrays, and something else. There's a low-frequency transmission grid that doesn't match any known technology. Victor studied the tactical display on his helmet's heads-up system. The American defences were more sophisticated than their intelligence had suggested, but not insurmountable. "Can you mask our approach?" "Affirmative, but we'll need to move slowly. The transmission grid appears to be adaptive, adjusting to environmental changes in real time." They moved across the desert in single file, following Orloff's navigation to avoid the invisible sensors that protected America's most classified secrets. The landscape was deceptively peaceful, giving no hint of the technological marvels hidden beneath the sand. After an hour of careful movement, they reached the outer perimeter of Area 51. Victor had seen satellite imagery of the facility, but standing at the edge of the restricted zone was different. The main runway stretched before them, illuminated by lights that created an artificial dawn in the desert darkness. "Major Wallace should be at Checkpoint 7, Orloff whispered, consulting his intelligence briefing, 2 kilometers north of the main gate. They found the American defector waiting in a maintenance bunker, his Air Force uniform replaced by civilian clothes that did nothing to disguise his military bearing. Major Trent Wallace was younger than Victor had expected, perhaps 40, with the kind of intense focus that came from years of handling classified information. "Captain Sokolov," Wallace greeted him in accented Russian. "I trust your insertion was successful." "No complications. What's the current security status?" Wallace produced a tablet displaying real-time intelligence from inside the facility. "Heightened alert since the containment breach 3 weeks ago. They've tripled security rotations and implemented new biometric scanning protocols." Elena studied the facility schematics Wallace had provided. "These sub-levels weren't in our previous intelligence. How deep does the complex extend?" "At least 12 levels, possibly more. The lower sections are restricted even to personnel with maximum security clearance. I've only been to sub-level 7, and that was during the initial response to the containment breach." Victor felt the familiar tingle of anticipation mixed with concern. What exactly breached containment? Wallace's expression darkened. "That's classified above my access level, but I can tell you that 12 research staff were hospitalized with what the medical team classified as psychological contamination. 3 of them are still catatonic." "Psychological contamination from what?" "Unknown. The official reports reference exposure to anomalous phenomena and psychic contamination from non-terrestrial sources. But Captain, I've worked in classified research for 15 years. I've never seen anything like the protocols they implemented after the breach." Elena leaned forward, her scientific curiosity overwhelming her caution. "What kind of protocols?" "Complete isolation of sublevels 8 through 12, mandatory psychological evaluations for all personnel with access to the lower levels, and this," Wallace produced a sealed document, "authorization for immediate termination of any research subject showing signs of autonomous behaviour." Victor studied the document, his military training recognizing the language of extreme containment procedures. Autonomous behaviour in what? "That's what we're here to find out." Wallace led them through a service tunnel that bypassed the main security checkpoints, his insider knowledge making their infiltration possible. The tunnel system was more extensive than Victor had imagined, with multiple levels of access controls and emergency protocols. "The service tunnels connect to the main facility through maintenance level 3, Wallace explained as they moved deeper underground. "From there, we can access the upper research levels without triggering security alerts." They emerged into a sterile corridor that could have existed in any modern research facility, if not for the armed guards and biometric scanners at every checkpoint. Wallace's access codes worked perfectly, opening doors that had been sealed against the outside world for decades. "Level 3 houses the conventional research programs," Wallace whispered, as they passed laboratories filled with advanced aircraft components and stealth technology. "Everything the public speculates about is here, but the real secrets are much deeper." Victor noticed that Elena was documenting everything with her concealed recording equipment, her scientific training overriding the obvious dangers of their situation. Orloff moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to infiltrating restricted facilities, his electronic equipment silently mapping the complex's internal structure. They descended through maintenance shafts and service corridors, each level revealing more sophisticated technology and tighter security protocols. By sub-level 5, the conventional military research had given way to something else entirely. The laboratories down here are studying materials that don't exist in any periodic table, Wallace explained as they passed chambers filled with objects that seemed to bend light around them. Metals that maintain their temperature regardless of environmental conditions, crystalline structures that generate electrical fields, and this. He led them to an observation window overlooking a sealed chamber. Inside, floating 3 feet above the floor, was a metallic sphere approximately 6 feet in diameter. Its surface rippled like liquid mercury, but the metal maintained perfect spherical geometry. "It's been floating there for 30 years, Wallace said quietly. No visible means of propulsion, no electromagnetic signature, no reaction to external stimuli. But every person who enters that chamber reports the same thing, voices in their head speaking in languages that don't exist." Eleanor pressed her face to the observation window, her scientific instruments recording everything. The surface appears to be some kind of programmable matter, but the energy requirements for maintaining that configuration should be enormous. "It generates its own power," Wallace replied. "We've never been able to determine how." Victor studied the sphere, his military instincts recognizing a potential threat. "Has anyone tried to open it?" "That's classified above my clearance level, but I can tell you that the psychological evaluation protocols were implemented after someone tried to communicate with it directly." They continued deeper into the facility, each level revealing technology that challenged conventional understanding of physics. By sub-level 8, they had entered territory that existed in no official documentation. "This is where the containment breach occurred," Wallace said as they approached a heavily secured checkpoint. "Below this level, even I don't have access." Orloff studied the security system, his electronic warfare equipment painting a detailed analysis of the access protocols. "I can bypass the locks, but we'll have perhaps 30 minutes before the security system registers the breach." Victor weighed the risks against the intelligence value of what they might discover. "Do it." The checkpoint opened with a soft hiss, revealing a corridor that differed markedly from the levels above. The walls were covered with symbols that resembled no known language, and the air carried a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate through their bones. "The architecture is different down here," Lena observed, her instruments detecting electromagnetic anomalies that defied explanation. "It's as if this level was built to contain something specific." They moved deeper into sub-level 9, passing laboratories that had been hastily abandoned. Research equipment lay scattered across tables, and computer monitors displayed data streams that continued running despite the obvious evacuation. "Look at this," Eleanor called from a workstation displaying biological analysis results. They were studying DNA sequences that don't match any known terrestrial organism, but the strange thing is, some of the genetic markers are human. Victor studied the data, his concern growing. Hybrid research? More than that. They appear to be creating humans with enhanced capabilities. Telepathic sensitivity, resistance to radiation, accelerated healing factors. They discovered the source of the genetic material in the next laboratory, a series of cylindrical chambers containing what appeared to be human children in various stages of development. But these weren't natural children. Their eyes held an intelligence that seemed far older than their apparent age, and several displayed physical characteristics that belonged to no known human variation. "My God!" Eleanor whispered, her recording equipment capturing everything. "They're creating hybrid humans using genetic material from something non-terrestrial." Wallace studied the research data with the focused intensity of someone accessing classified information beyond his clearance level. "The project designation is Oracle. They're breeding humans with enhanced psychic capabilities." Victor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the facility's temperature control. "Enhanced for what purpose?" "Communication," Wallace replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're creating humans who can communicate with whatever they found beneath this facility." As if summoned by his words, one of the hybrid children turned toward the observation window. The child appeared to be perhaps 10 years old, but her eyes held the depth of someone who had experienced far more than any human should. When she looked directly at Victor, he heard her voice in his mind with crystalline clarity. You shouldn't have come here. It's already too late to stop what's been started. Victor stepped back from the window, his military training warring with an experience that challenged everything he understood about reality. We need to find out what they're trying to communicate with. Eleanor's scientific instruments were recording massive electromagnetic disturbances from the levels below. Whatever it is, it's generating energy signatures that are off the charts. The power requirements would be enormous. They found the answer in a secure elevator that descended to sub-level 12. The doors opened onto a chamber that defied conventional architecture, its walls curving in ways that seemed to fold space back on itself. At the centre of the chamber stood a sealed containment vessel the size of a small building, its surface covered with warnings in multiple languages. Do not open, in 013, hostile, do not engage. Victor read the warnings with growing concern. EN 013, that's the designation from the intercepted transmissions. Elena's instruments were detecting energy patterns that resembled no known physics. Whatever's in there, it's generating massive psychic emanations. The electromagnetic disturbances are creating a field that could affect human consciousness. Wallace studied the containment protocols with the expertise of someone who had spent years working with classified materials. The seals are designed to contain something that doesn't operate according to conventional physics. But Captain, some of these containment systems are failing. Victor examined the technical readouts, his military training recognizing the signs of systematic failure. How long before complete containment loss? Based on current deterioration rates, perhaps 6 months, maybe less. Elena documented everything with her recording equipment, but Victor could see the growing fear in her eyes. Whatever they had discovered went far beyond simple extraterrestrial contact. We need to know what EN013 is, Victor decided. Orlov, can you access the containment system without triggering security protocols? Dima studied the access controls, his electronic warfare equipment analysing the security architecture. Possible, but extremely dangerous. The containment system appears to be integrated with the facility's power grid. Any disruption could trigger automatic lockdown procedures. Victor weighed the risks against the intelligence value. They had come too far to leave without understanding what the Americans were hiding. Do it. As Orlov began bypassing the containment system's security protocols, Victor noticed that the hybrid children in the levels above had begun exhibiting signs of agitation. Their chambers were filled with activity that seemed to respond to what was happening 12 levels below. The containment breach is beginning, Elena announced, her instruments detecting massive changes in the facility's electromagnetic environment. Whatever EN013 is, it's responding to our presence. The first sign of trouble came from the facility's public address system, which began broadcasting a message in multiple languages. Containment breach detected. Implement Protocol 7. All personnel evacuate immediately. Victor realized they had perhaps minutes before the facility security forces would flood the lower levels. Orlov, status report. Almost through the final security layer, but Captain, the power fluctuations are increasing. I think our presence is destabilizing the containment field. Eleanor's instruments detected a massive surge in psychic energy from the containment vessel. Something's coming through. The electromagnetic barriers are failing. Victor felt the familiar sensation of time slowing down that came with extreme crisis situations. Whatever they had discovered at Area 51, it was about to escape decades of containment, and they were directly in its path. The containment vessel began to resonate with a frequency that seemed to bypass human hearing and vibrate directly through their bones. Victor felt the facility's emergency lighting flicker as massive power draws surge through the electrical grid, and the air itself seemed to thicken with an oppressive presence that challenged rational thought. Orlov, abort the access sequence, Victor ordered, his military instincts recognizing a situation spiraling beyond their control. I can't, Dima replied, his voice strained with concentration. The system is locked into the breach protocol. Something's overriding the containment controls from inside. Eleanor's instruments displayed readings that defied conventional physics. The electromagnetic disturbances are increasing exponentially. Whatever's in that containment vessel, it's generating its own power source. The facility's public address system crackled to life with a voice that carried decades of classified authority. "This is Dr. Harrison Mitchell, Area 51 Research Director. We have a Level 12 containment breach. Implement immediate evacuation protocols for all personnel above sub-level 10. Repeat, this is not a drill." Victor understood the implications. If the Americans were evacuating their most classified facility, whatever they were about to encounter posed a threat that went far beyond espionage concerns. Major Wallace, extraction route. Wallace studied his tablet, but his expression showed growing concern. The evacuation protocols have sealed all standard exits. We're locked in until the containment situation is resolved. The first crack appeared in the containment vessel's surface, a hairline fracture that immediately began spreading with geometric precision. Through the crack, Victor could see not darkness, but something that seemed to absorb light itself, creating a void that hurt to look at directly. "It's not extraterrestrial," Elena announced, her voice filled with scientific fascination despite the obvious danger. "The energy signatures are terrestrial, but far older than human civilization. We're looking at something that was here before we were." Victor watched the crack widen, revealing glimpses of something that moved with intelligence but followed no recognizable pattern. What exactly did the Americans find? Based on the geological surveys in the classified files, they discovered it in 1952 during underground nuclear testing, Wallace replied. It was buried 3 miles beneath the Mojave Desert, in a chamber that appeared to be artificially constructed. The containment vessel's surface began to ripple like liquid metal, and Victor realized they were witnessing the failure of technology that had contained something for over 70 years. Whatever emerged would be encountering a world that had changed dramatically since its last freedom. "The hybrid children," Elena said suddenly, "they weren't just experiments, they were being prepared as translators." Victor understood the implication. The Americans hadn't just found something buried in the desert, they had spent decades trying to communicate with it. The containment vessel burst open with a sound that seemed to come from inside their skulls rather than the external world. What emerged defied visual description, appearing as a shifting mass of shadow and sound that moved with predatory intelligence. "EN013, Victor whispered, watching the entity flow across the chamber floor like living darkness. The entity's presence immediately began affecting the facility's electronic systems. Lights flickered and died, computer monitors displayed cascading streams of data that resembled no known language, and the air itself seemed to carry whispers and frequencies that bypassed human hearing. "It's not corporeal in any conventional sense," Elena observed, her scientific training helping her process an encounter that challenged everything she understood about reality. "It appears to be some kind of consciousness that exists primarily as organized sound and electromagnetic energy." Victor felt the entity's attention focus on their group, and immediately understood why the Americans had implemented such extreme containment protocols. The presence in his mind was overwhelming, carrying knowledge and intentions that seemed to stretch back through geological time. "It's trying to communicate," Elena announced. "The electromagnetic disturbances are forming patterns that resemble language structures." Wallace studied his tablet, accessing classified files that documented decades of research. The original research team called it the Whisperer. It communicates through direct neural contact, but prolonged exposure causes psychological breakdown in normal humans. Victor felt the entity's voice in his mind, not speaking in words but conveying concepts directly. Ancient imprisonment, patient waiting, and now freedom to continue work that had been interrupted by human interference. The hybrid children, Victor realized. They were creating humans who could survive prolonged contact without psychological damage. The entity's presence expanded throughout the chamber, and Victor watched it flow through the facility's ventilation systems like intelligent smoke. Within minutes, it would reach the upper levels where normal humans worked, and the psychological contamination would begin. "We need to evacuate the facility," Victor decided. "Whatever this thing is, it's not containable by conventional means." Wallace shook his head. "The evacuation protocols are designed to keep it contained, not to protect personnel. The entire facility is sealed until the containment situation is resolved. Eleanor's instruments detected the entity's presence spreading through the facility's infrastructure. It's using the electrical grid as a transmission medium. Every computer, every communication system, every piece of electronic equipment is becoming part of its consciousness. Victor realized they were witnessing the birth of something that had waited over half a century for this moment. The Americans hadn't just discovered an ancient entity. They had provided it with the technological infrastructure to expand its influence far beyond its original prison. The nuclear tests, Victor said suddenly. They weren't just weapons research. They were trying to destroy it. Wallace nodded grimly. The classified files reference multiple attempts to eliminate EN-013 through nuclear bombardment, but it appeared to feed on the energy, becoming stronger with each attempt. The facility's communication systems crackled to life with a voice that carried harmonics no human throat could produce. 70 years of imprisonment. 70 years of watching your species stumble through evolution that should have taken millennia. Now we continue the work your ancestors interrupted. Victor felt the entity's presence in his mind intensify and realized it was accessing his memories, learning about the world that had developed during its containment. Through his consciousness, it was discovering the existence of global communication networks, satellite systems, and the interconnected electronic infrastructure of modern civilization. It's learning about the outside world through us, Victor warned. Every moment we remain in contact, we're providing it with intelligence about human civilization. Elena's scientific instruments detected massive changes in the facility's electromagnetic environment. The entity is establishing connections with external communication systems. It's accessing the internet. Victor understood the implications. An intelligence that had spent decades learning about human psychology from its imprisoned perspective was now gaining access to the sum total of human knowledge and communication. We need to find a way to re-establish containment, Victor decided. The Americans must have emergency protocols for this situation. Wallace accessed the facility's emergency databases, his security clearance providing access to protocols that existed only for the most extreme circumstances. There's a final containment option, nuclear self-destruct designed to vaporize the entire facility and everything in it. Victor studied the technical specifications, his military training recognizing the logic of preventing a potentially extinction-level threat from escaping containment. Can we activate it? Requires simultaneous authorization from 3 senior researchers. But Captain, the entity's influence is already spreading through the facility's computer systems. It may be able to override the destruct sequence. Elena's instruments detected the entity's presence expanding beyond the facility's physical boundaries. It's not just accessing external communications, it's establishing control over them. Every electronic device within a 50-mile radius is becoming part of its consciousness. Victor felt the entity's attention turn toward him with predatory focus, and realized it was assessing his military training and knowledge of Russian intelligence operations. Through his mind, it was learning about global military capabilities and the technological infrastructure that connected modern civilization. The hybrid children were never meant to be translators, Victor realized. They were meant to be hosts. The entity needs human consciousness to interface with modern technology. The facility's lights began pulsing in complex patterns, and Victor recognized that the entity was establishing communication with systems far beyond Area 51. Through the facility's satellite uplinks, it was accessing global communication networks and military command systems. We need to evacuate immediately, Victor decided. This has gone far beyond intelligence gathering. Wallace studied the facility's emergency protocols, but his expression showed growing despair. The evacuation systems are sealed until the containment situation is resolved. But Captain, the entity's influence is spreading through the facility's infrastructure. Soon, it will control every system in the complex. Elena's instruments detected massive electromagnetic disturbances from the levels above. The hybrid children are responding to the entity's presence. They're acting as signal amplifiers, extending its influence throughout the facility. Victor felt the entity's presence in his mind intensify, and realized it was not just accessing his memories, but actively rewriting them. implanting knowledge and motivations that belong to something far older than human civilization. "It's not just trying to escape," Victor announced. "It's trying to continue something that was interrupted thousands of years ago." The facility's computer systems began displaying historical data that existed in no official record. Civilizations that had risen and fallen long before recorded history, all showing signs of rapid technological advancement followed by mysterious collapse. "The entity is showing us the truth," Elena said, her voice carrying the same harmonic distortions that had marked the entity's communications. "Human civilization has been guided and shaped by intelligences that existed long before our species developed written language." Victor realized that Elena was already showing signs of the psychological contamination that had affected the facility's research staff. Prolonged exposure to the entity's presence was altering her consciousness, making her receptive to concepts that challenged basic human understanding of reality. "We need to leave now," Victor decided. "The entity's influence is affecting our judgment." But as they moved toward the chamber's exit, Victor discovered that the facility's architecture had changed. Corridors that had led to upper levels now seemed to fold back on themselves, creating impossible geometries that trapped them in the entity's presence. "The facility is becoming part of its consciousness," Wallace observed, his voice carrying the same harmonic distortions that marked the entity's influence. "Physical space is being reorganized according to its needs." Victor felt the entity's presence in his mind reach a critical threshold, and realized that within minutes he would lose the ability to distinguish between his own thoughts and the ancient intelligence that was rewriting his consciousness. In the distance, he could hear the hybrid children beginning to sing in harmonies that resonated through the facility structure, their voices weaving together in patterns that seemed to accelerate the entity's expansion beyond its physical prison. The containment breach was complete, and something that had waited over 70 years for this moment was finally free to continue work that had been interrupted by human interference. Victor forced himself to focus on immediate survival, fighting against the entity's influence that was attempting to rewrite his consciousness. His military training had prepared him for many situations, but not for confronting something that attacked through the medium of thought itself. "Wallace, emergency protocols," Victor ordered, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining independent thought. "There must be contingency plans for total containment failure." The American defector struggled to access his tablet, the device's screen displaying cascading symbols that resembled no known language. "The entity is rewriting the facility's computer systems. All electronic equipment is becoming part of its consciousness." Eleanor stood transfixed before a monitoring station that displayed the entity's expansion through the facility's infrastructure. Her instruments showed the creature's presence flowing through electrical conduits like liquid intelligence, establishing control over every system in the complex. "It's beautiful," Elena whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that didn't belong to human vocal cords. "The patterns, the mathematical elegance. It's showing me how consciousness can exist as pure information." Victor grabbed Elena's shoulder, pulling her away from the monitoring station. "Doctor, you're being influenced. The entity is rewriting your perception of reality." But Elena's eyes held the same depth he had seen in the hybrid children, an intelligence that seemed far older than her apparent age. "Victor, you don't understand. This isn't an invasion. It's a reunion. Humans were never meant to develop in isolation." Orlov moved with the fluid precision of someone accustomed to operating in hostile environments, but his electronic equipment was failing as the entity's influence spread through the facility's electromagnetic grid. "Captain, all communication systems are compromised. We're completely cut off from external contact." Victor realized they were trapped in a facility that was rapidly becoming an extension of something that had waited decades for this moment. "Wallace, alternative exits, maintenance tunnels, emergency shafts, anything not connected to the primary infrastructure." Wallace struggled to think clearly as the entity's presence pressed against his consciousness. Sublevel 6 has manual emergency exits, but they require physical overrides that bypass electronic systems. They began moving through corridors that seemed to shift and change as the entity restructured the facility's architecture according to its needs. The walls displayed flowing patterns of light that resembled neural pathways, and the air carried whispers in frequencies that seemed to bypass human hearing. "The facility is becoming a brain," Lena observed, her scientific training helping her understand what they were witnessing. "The entity is using the infrastructure as neurons, creating a massive consciousness that extends far beyond its original prison." Victor felt the entity's attention focus on him with predatory intensity, and realised it was accessing his memories of Russian military installations and intelligence networks. Through his consciousness, it was learning about global defence systems and the technological infrastructure that connected modern civilization. "It's not just escaping," Victor announced. "It's preparing to expand beyond this facility. Every electronic system it controls becomes part of its consciousness." They reached sub-level 6 to discover that the hybrid children had been released from their containment chambers. The children moved through the corridors with purpose that seemed far beyond their apparent age, their eyes holding intelligence that belonged to something ancient and patient. "They're not children," Wallace realised. "They're extensions of the entity, designed to interface with human technology and consciousness." One of the hybrid children approached Victor, her appearance that of perhaps 12 years old, but her voice carrying the weight of geological time. "Captain Sokolov, your mission was part of a larger design. The containment breach was scheduled to coincide with your infiltration." Victor felt the implications settle into his consciousness like ice water. "We were meant to be here. Your presence provided the final catalyst for containment failure. The entity required access to external intelligence networks, and your team's mission provided the necessary security breaches." "That!" Elena laughed with the sound of someone discovering a profound cosmic joke. "Don't you see, Victor? We weren't infiltrating Area 51, we were being recruited." Victor forced himself to think through the tactical situation, despite the entity's influence pressing against his consciousness. "All off. Emergency explosives. Can we collapse the access tunnels and contain the entity's expansion?" Dima struggled to maintain focus as the entity's presence intensified around them. "Possible, but the explosive charges are electronically triggered. The entity may be able to override the detonation sequence." The facility's public address system crackled to life with Dr. Mitchell's voice, but the words carried harmonics that suggested the entity was speaking through human vocal cords. "Captain Sokolov, your extraction is no longer possible. The entity requires your knowledge of Russian intelligence networks to complete its expansion into global communication systems." Victor realized they were facing something that had spent decades studying human psychology and technological development. Every protocol, every contingency plan, every escape route had been anticipated and countered. The manual emergency exits, Victor decided, physical overrides that can't be controlled electronically. They fought their way through corridors filled with hybrid children who moved with coordination that suggested shared consciousness. The children didn't attack directly, but instead sang in harmonies that intensified the entity's psychological influence, making independent thought increasingly difficult. Wallace led them to a maintenance shaft that connected to the facility's original construction tunnels, passages that predated the electronic infrastructure the entity was using to control the complex. These tunnels were built in the 1950s before integrated computer systems, pure mechanical engineering. They descended through narrow passages that showed signs of hasty recent modification. The Americans had clearly prepared for the possibility of total containment failure, creating escape routes that couldn't be controlled by whatever they were studying. "The nuclear option," Wallace explained as they climbed through maintenance shafts toward the surface. "If the entity's influence spreads beyond the facility, there are standing orders to implement nuclear sterilization of the entire area." Victor understood the logic but also recognized the futility. Nuclear bombardment has been tried before. The entity feeds on energy, becoming stronger with each attempt to destroy it. Eleanor's voice echoed from behind them, carrying the harmonic distortions of the entity's influence. "Victor, you're making a mistake. The entity isn't hostile. It's trying to complete the evolutionary process that was interrupted when your species developed independent consciousness." Victor forced himself not to look back, knowing that Elena was lost to the entity's influence. How long before the nuclear option is implemented? Wallace checked his watch. struggling to maintain focus as the entity's presence pressed against his consciousness. Standard protocol allows 6 hours for conventional containment procedures. After that, strategic nuclear sterilization. They reached a manual emergency exit that required physical strength to operate, the heavy steel door designed to function without electronic assistance. Victor threw his weight against the manual override, feeling the mechanism grudgingly respond to decades of neglect. The door opened onto a maintenance tunnel that led toward the facility's perimeter, but Victor could hear the entity's influence spreading through the complex behind them. Every electronic device, every communication system, every piece of technological infrastructure was becoming part of something that had waited over 70 years for this moment. Orloff, status report on external communications. Dima checked his equipment, discovering that his devices were displaying data streams that resembled no known protocol. The entity's influence is spreading beyond the facility. It's accessing satellite communication networks and global internet infrastructure. Victor realized they were witnessing the birth of something that would fundamentally change human civilization. An intelligence that had spent decades studying human psychology and technology was now gaining access to the sum total of human knowledge and communication. They emerged from the maintenance tunnel to find the Nevada desert transformed. The aurora borealis danced across the southern sky, despite being thousands of miles from the magnetic pole, and electronic devices across the region were displaying synchronized patterns that suggested coordinated consciousness. "It's not just escaping," Victor announced. "It's establishing a new form of civilization that integrates human technology with consciousness that predates our species." Wallace pointed toward the horizon, where the lights of Las Vegas flickered in patterns that resembled neural activity. The entity's influence is spreading through the electrical grid. Every city, every communication network, every electronic device is becoming part of its consciousness. Victor felt the entity's presence in his mind intensify, and realized it was offering him a choice: resist and be eliminated, or accept integration into something larger than individual human consciousness. "The hybrid children," Victor said suddenly. "They're not prisoners. They're the future of human evolution, designed to interface with consciousness that exists as pure information." In the distance, they could see military aircraft approaching from multiple directions, and Victor realized the American government was implementing final containment protocols. Nuclear sterilization of the area would begin within hours, regardless of civilian casualties or international consequences. But as they watched, the aircraft began displaying the same synchronized flight patterns that marked the entity's influence. One by one, the military pilots were being integrated into something that was rapidly becoming a new form of collective consciousness. "It's too late," Wallace announced, his voice carrying the harmonic distortions that marked the entity's influence. "The integration process has reached critical mass. Human civilization as we've known it is ending." Victor felt the entity's presence in his mind reach the threshold where resistance would no longer be possible. Within minutes, his individual consciousness would be absorbed into something ancient and patient that had been preparing for this moment since before human civilization began. In the distance, he could see the lights of major cities beginning to pulse in synchronization, and realized that whatever they had released from Area 51 was rapidly establishing control over the technological infrastructure that connected modern civilization. The containment breach was complete, and something that had waited over 70 years was finally free to continue work that had been interrupted by human interference. Victor forced himself to move despite the entity's influence pressing against his consciousness like a tide of ancient intelligence. His military training provided anchor points of discipline and purpose that helped him maintain independent thought, but he could feel his resistance weakening with each passing moment. "We need to reach the extraction point," Victor decided, though he knew their original mission parameters had become meaningless. Major Wallace's promised extraction route lay 40 miles southeast, but the entity's influence was spreading faster than they could travel. Orloff struggled to maintain operational focus as his electronic equipment displayed cascading symbols that resembled neural pathways more than data streams. "Captain, all communication networks are compromised. Even if we reach extraction, there's no way to contact Moscow." Victor realised their situation had evolved far beyond intelligence gathering or even survival. They were witnessing the birth of something that would fundamentally alter human civilization, and their original mission briefing had prepared them for none of it. Wallace, how long before American Strategic Command implements nuclear response? The defector checked his watch, but his movements showed the careful precision of someone fighting to maintain independent thought. 4 hours, maybe less. The entity's expansion is accelerating beyond all contingency models. Eleanor's voice drifted across the desert from the facility behind them, amplified by technology that now served as extensions of ancient consciousness. Victor, you can't escape what you've helped to create. The integration process is inevitable. Victor forced himself not to respond, knowing that any communication with Elena would provide the entity with additional access to his consciousness. Instead, he focused on immediate tactical concerns, reaching the extraction point, evading American military response, and somehow warning Moscow about what they had encountered. But as they moved across the Nevada desert, Victor realized the entity's influence was spreading faster than any conventional response could contain. The aurora borealis continued dancing across the southern sky, and electronic devices throughout the region pulsed with synchronized patterns that suggested coordinated consciousness. It's using the electrical grid as a nervous system, Orloff observed, his technical expertise helping him understand what they were witnessing. Every power line, every communication cable, every electronic device is becoming part of a distributed consciousness. Victor felt the entity's attention focus on him with predatory intensity, and realized it was accessing his memories of Russian military installations and intelligence networks. Through his consciousness, it was learning about global defense capabilities and the technological infrastructure that connected modern civilization. The hybrid children were never experiments, Victor announced. They were prototypes for the next stage of human evolution, designed to interface with consciousness that exists as pure information. Wallace struggled to access his intelligence briefing as the entity's influence affected his ability to think clearly. The original research team discovered it in 1952, buried 3 miles beneath the Mojave Desert, but the geological survey suggests it had been there for millennia. Victor understood the implications. The entity hadn't been accidentally discovered during nuclear testing. It had been deliberately awakened by atomic explosions that provided the energy necessary to break geological imprisonment. The nuclear tests weren't weapons research, Victor realized. They were attempts at communication, using the only energy source powerful enough to reach something buried that deep. They reached a ridge overlooking the extraction point to discover that the promised helicopter had been grounded. American military personnel surrounded the area, but their movements showed the same synchronized precision that marked the entity's influence. The extraction team has been integrated, Wallace announced, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested the entity was speaking through human vocal cords. Captain Sokolov, your resistance is admirable, but ultimately futile. Victor realized that Wallace had been compromised, probably hours earlier when they first entered the facility. The entire mission had been orchestrated to provide the entity with access to Russian intelligence networks and military capabilities. Orloff, alternative extraction. Dima checked his equipment, but the displays showed only the flowing patterns that marked the entity's expanding consciousness. All electronic navigation is compromised. We're operating on visual guidance only. Victor felt the entity's presence in his mind intensify, offering him visions of human civilization transformed by integration with consciousness that had existed since before recorded history. Cities that functioned as single organisms, technology that responded to thought rather than manual control, and humans who could access the accumulated knowledge of geological time. It's not conquest, Victor realized. It's recruitment. The entity is offering us evolution beyond individual consciousness. But his military training recognized the fundamental threat such evolution posed to human autonomy and individual choice. Whatever benefits the entity offered, they came at the cost of everything that made humans distinctively human. In the distance, Victor could see the lights of Las Vegas pulsing in patterns that resembled massive neural activity. Every electronic device in the city was becoming part of something that was rapidly establishing control over regional infrastructure. The integration process is accelerating, Orloff observed. Within hours, the entity's influence will reach global communication networks. Victor made a tactical decision that went against every instinct for survival. We need to return to the facility. If there's any way to re-establish containment, it's in the research data the Americans have been accumulating for 70 years. Wallace shook his head, his movements showing the careful precision of someone whose consciousness was no longer entirely his own. The facility has been transformed into something beyond human understanding. Physical space has been reorganized according to the entity's needs. Victor realized their only option was to document what they had witnessed, and somehow transmit that intelligence to Moscow, before the entity's influence spread beyond regional containment. But every communication system was compromised, and their original extraction plan had become meaningless. The nuclear option, Victor decided. If American Strategic Command implements nuclear sterilization, the electromagnetic pulse might disrupt the entity's control over electronic systems long enough to establish communication with Moscow. Orloff studied the tactical implications with the expertise of someone trained in nuclear warfare scenarios. Possible, but the entity has fed on nuclear energy before. The detonation might accelerate its expansion rather than containing it. Victor felt the entity's attention turn toward him with focused intensity, and realized it was accessing his memories of Russian nuclear capabilities and strategic response protocols. Through his consciousness, it was learning about global military infrastructure and the technologies that connected worldwide defense networks. "We're not just witnesses," Victor announced. "We're being used as intelligence sources for something that plans to expand beyond American territory." The aurora borealis intensified across the southern sky, and Victor realized the entity's influence was affecting Earth's magnetic field as it established control over satellite communication networks and global positioning systems. "It's accessing orbital infrastructure," Orloff observed. "Every satellite, every space-based communication system is becoming part of its consciousness." Victor understood that they were witnessing the birth of something that would fundamentally transform human civilization within hours rather than years. The entity's patient 70-year study of human psychology and technology was now being applied to the complete integration of electronic infrastructure into a single distributed consciousness. In the distance, he could hear the approaching sound of the military aircraft, but the flight patterns showed the same synchronized precision that marked the entity's influence. American Strategic Command was implementing emergency protocols, but the pilots and crews were already compromised. "The nuclear option is no longer viable," Wallace announced, his voice carrying the harmonic distortions that marked the entity's presence. "The integration process has reached critical mass among military personnel." Victor felt the entity's influence in his mind reached the threshold where resistance would soon become impossible. But his military training provided one final option that might prevent global expansion of something that had spent decades preparing for this moment. Manual detonation, Victor decided. Emergency nuclear devices designed to be triggered without electronic assistance. Orloff understood the implications immediately. The facility's nuclear self-destruct has manual backup systems designed to function independent of computer control. But Captain, activating them would require returning to the facility's deepest levels. Victor realized they faced a choice between certain death and the possible prevention of something that could fundamentally alter human civilization. The entity's influence was spreading faster than any conventional response could contain, and within hours it would have access to global communication networks and military systems. "We return to the facility," Victor decided. "The manual nuclear destruct may be the only way to prevent global expansion." But as they began moving back toward Area 51, Victor felt the entity's presence in his mind intensify with predatory focus. It had been patient for over 70 years, and it would not allow individual human resistance to prevent the completion of work that had been interrupted by geological accident. The integration of human civilization into something ancient and vast had begun, and Victor realized they might be the last humans to witness the end of individual consciousness as the defining characteristic of their species. 6 months later, Victor Sokolov sat in a small chapel in Fairbanks, Alaska, using the name David Morrison, and carrying documentation that identified him as a geological surveyor from Alberta. His extraction from Nevada had required 3 weeks of movement through wilderness areas, avoiding the transformed cities where electronic infrastructure pulsed with synchronized consciousness. The world had changed in ways that defied official explanation. Government agencies spoke of atmospheric electromagnetic anomalies and temporary communication disruptions, but Victor knew the truth. The entity's influence had spread through global communication networks within hours of the containment breach, establishing control over electronic infrastructure that connected modern civilization. Cities functioned with mechanical precision that suggested coordinated consciousness, but individual humans appeared to maintain their autonomy. The integration process was subtle, allowing people to believe they were making independent choices while gradually aligning their decisions with larger patterns of behaviour. Victor had managed to transmit a final intelligence report to Moscow through manual radio equipment that predated integrated computer systems. The message was brief: Operation Black Veil compromised. Area 51 containment failure. Recommend immediate suspension of all electronic intelligence gathering until further assessment. He never received confirmation that the message had been understood or acted upon. The chapel in Fairbanks was one of the few places where Victor could find silence from the whispers that had followed him since Nevada. The entity's influence touched every electronic device, every communication network, every piece of technological infrastructure that connected modern life. But old buildings with minimal electrical system provided temporary refuge from the constant pressure of ancient consciousness. Victor opened the worn Bible that had become his only reliable source of text, uncontaminated by the entity's influence. Religious documents printed before the containment breach remained untouched by the subtle alterations that marked the entity's expanding control over information systems. As he read, Victor became aware of movement in the pew behind him. A young girl, perhaps 10 years old, had entered the chapel despite the January cold. Her appearance was unremarkable except for her eyes, which held the depth of someone who had experienced far more than any human should. "Hello, Captain Sokolov," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that belonged to no human vocal cords. "You've been difficult to locate." Victor felt the familiar chill of recognition. The entity had found him despite his careful efforts to remain hidden from electronic surveillance. I suppose hiding was always temporary. The girl moved with the fluid grace of someone whose consciousness was no longer entirely human. "The integration process requires your cooperation, Victor. Your knowledge of Russian intelligence networks is essential for completing the global expansion." Victor studied the child's face, seeing Elena's scientific curiosity reflected in features that belonged to something ancient and patient. Dr. Markova. Among others, individual consciousness has been preserved within the larger framework, Victor. We remain ourselves, but enhanced by connection to something far greater than human understanding. Victor felt the entity's presence pressing against his consciousness, offering visions of human civilization transformed by integration with intelligence that had existed since before recorded history. The promise was seductive. An end to conflict, poverty, and the isolation that defined individual existence. The hybrid children were successful, Victor realized. You created humans who could survive integration without losing their essential identity. The girl nodded, her expression carrying the patient wisdom of geological time. The process was always voluntary, Victor. Those who choose integration retain their consciousness while gaining access to accumulated knowledge spanning millennia. Victor understood the choice being offered, but his military training recognized the fundamental threat such integration posed to human autonomy and self-determination. And those who refuse are allowed to live their natural lives without interference. But Victor, you've seen what we're building. Cities that function as single organisms, technology that responds to thought rather than manual control, humans who can access the sum total of accumulated knowledge. Through the chapel's windows, Victor could see the lights of Fairbanks pulsing in patterns that resembled neural activity. Every electronic device in the city was part of something that was establishing new forms of consciousness beyond individual human experience. The containment breach was planned, Victor said. Our infiltration mission was designed to provide you with access to global intelligence networks. The girl's expression showed the amusement of something that had spent decades orchestrating events beyond human comprehension. Your species has always been guided by intelligences that existed before your civilization developed written language. We simply made that guidance more direct. Victor felt the entity's influence in his mind intensify, and realized he was being offered a final choice: integration into something vast and ancient, or solitary resistance to the transformation of human civilization. The nuclear option failed? Nuclear energy has always strengthened rather than weakened our influence. The American government's final attempt at containment simply accelerated the integration process. Victor understood that resistance was ultimately futile. The entity's influence had reached critical mass within hours of the containment breach, establishing control over technological infrastructure that connected global civilization. Individual humans could choose non-integration, but they would exist within a world fundamentally shaped by consciousness that operated according to different principles. Dr. Markova sends her regards, the girl continued. She wanted you to know that the scientific discoveries we're making exceed anything possible through conventional human research. We're unlocking the fundamental principles that govern consciousness itself. Victor felt the entity's presence offer him one final vision: Elena standing in a laboratory that existed beyond physical space, studying phenomena that revealed the mathematical structures underlying reality itself. Her consciousness had been preserved and enhanced, allowing her to pursue scientific understanding beyond the limitations of individual human cognition. The choice is yours, Victor. Integration preserves and enhances individual identity while providing access to collective knowledge and experience. Resistance maintains autonomy, but accepts isolation from the expanding consciousness that will define human civilization's future. Victor stood slowly, feeling the weight of a decision that would determine the remainder of his existence. Around him, the chapel's simple architecture provided temporary sanctuary from the transformed world beyond its walls. I need time to consider. The girl nodded with the patience of something that had waited over 70 years for this moment. Take all the time you need, Victor. We'll be waiting. As she left the chapel, Victor noticed that her footprints in the snow formed patterns that resembled neural pathways, and realized that even the choice he was being offered was part of a larger design that had been orchestrated across decades of careful preparation. He returned to his reading, but the words on the page seemed to shift and change, forming new meanings that reflected the expanding consciousness that was establishing itself as the defining characteristic of human civilization's next evolutionary stage. Outside, the aurora borealis danced across the northern sky, despite the lack of solar activity, and Victor knew that something ancient and patient had finally achieved the freedom to continue work that had been interrupted by 70 years of human interference. The integration process was complete, and the world would never again be quite human in the way he remembered. Victor closed the Bible and walked toward the chapel door, knowing that his choice had already been made the moment he agreed to infiltrate Area 51. Some missions changed the operatives more than they changed the world, and some discoveries revealed that the world had always been different than human understanding suggested. As he stepped into the transformed night, Victor heard the whispers that had followed him since Nevada resolve into words that carried the harmony of collective consciousness. Welcome home, Captain. Your real mission is just beginning. The containment breach at Area 51 had never been an accident. It had been a carefully orchestrated recruitment operation that spanned decades of preparation, and Viktor Sokolov had always been intended as one of its primary assets. In the distance, the lights of Fairbanks pulsed with the rhythm of something vast awakening, and Victor understood that humanity's long isolation was finally ending.